Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 72nd episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all, and do not let your ears deceive you. I'm going to try and modulate the fact that I have a nasty lingering cough and to not completely sound obnoxious in your ears. I hope no one here is getting through any kind of annoying winter illness, especially these days. So, and all that. Everyone maintaining well? No one's got respiratory issues or anything like that? So.
I hope not.
I feel like I have hangover allergies from being in contact with four cats. Some friends have four cats at their apartment. As much Zyrtec as I take, there's always a day or two later, just still kind of in there.
Cats will get you every time.
I love our furry friends, but...
I assume, Jared, you have no worries with fuchsia on that front, otherwise you would have heard about that by now.
Yeah, no, I definitely would have been like, oh my god, I have to throw my cat in the garbage or whatever because she's getting me sick.
Don't do that.
We did adopted a dog that we thought would be fine, but now he's way happier on Long Island, so it's fine.
So often the way. No, I don't know.
I've never heard. Yeah, it's the only case of someone being happier on Long Island, honestly.
And it turned out to be a dog. That should tell you something. So, but we will regress from regional East Coast slander or move on from that.
I can't slander the East Coast because I don't know anything about it. So
there you go. So, or is it slander? I don't know. I never lived there myself. I was in upstate. That's its own thing. That's the part of the state New York doesn't pay attention to at all. So, in any event, moving on. So we've got a great subject. I still think this is a genius choice that we're coming up with, thanks to Jared. But we have some news, I guess. This is even more of a stretch this time, but hey, it's something. So, Jared, please do take it away.
yeah, it continues to be a fairly quiet start of the year in terms of active Tolkien news, but there are a couple things to note. First, while it had already been as good as confirmed, Amazon finally put out its formal notice about Season 3 of The Rings of Power, mixing the usual puffery about whatever nonsense they're going to dream up this time with a couple of concrete details. Production remains in the UK and is now specifically located at Shepperton Studios, a nearly century-old complex that's been a key center for film and TV production in the country for that time, while returning directors Charlotte Branstrom and Sana Hamri are joined by Stefan Schwartz. Meantime, the revived and redone Lord of the Rings musical has hit Australia for the first time ever, following an appropriately initial stop in New Zealand. Based on various photos and recordings, they've carried over the stage setup that was first seen in the Chicago stint the previous summer, and it seems that ever since the original revival in the UK, it's been steadily turning into more of a low-key worldwide crowd pleaser, with the exchange of the hyper-elaborate original staging and production for the more intimate approach, all around clearly being key. The production will continue to tour Australia for some time, and then Singapore, returning to the UK for the first time later this year for a stint in Plymouth. Link to the official musical website in our show notes.
It is interesting seeing how much of a success this thing is turning out to be in its new form. Doesn't seem like we're going to be seeing any return to either the West End or even a debut on Broadway anytime soon. It's not like aiming at that level, but all our caveats about the original recording and what we know about it and things like this, or the original score kept in mind. Hey, if this turns out to be a thing. So,
sure, why not?
Seems promising. I also did like all the various photos from the Australian premieres that basically, besides the usual cosplayers and all that, we had more than a few shots of people sort of like, oh, these are some of our current costume designers. And I'm like, you look like competitors on a drag race, iteration. And that's totally fine. I think that's great. So, we'll see where it goes from there. So, but yeah, no, it's interesting to see that go. As for the Rings of Power, meh. But,
whatever.
I mean, Hammery and Brandstrom, they seem to become turning into like the main directors for the whole series at this point. They've now worked on will be working on all 3 seasons. And the new guy, I sort of read his thing, is like, okay, new guy, whatever. Frankly, by the time this episode comes out, we'll be a few days away from the return of a certain other fantasy series on Amazon called The Wheel of Time, and I am looking forward to that.
Oh my god, already?
Oh yeah. Season 3.
I somehow, I knew the trailer had come out. I didn't realize that the next season was about to start. Wow.
Yeah.
That's
Even I
great.
knew that, and I don't watch it.
News you can use.
There you go. Well, I'm glad to pass that along. And, again, we'll let people know, obviously we're not a Wheel of Time podcast. There are some great ones out there. The Tarvalon one that Preeti Shiver helps run and things like that. But we will say that if you want debates among people about fidelity to books and things like this, you can get that with that fan base too and all that. So it's a tradition. So it can be done. But anyway, so if there's more news to come, there is a note, by the way, just very last minute, I saw that Roar the Rohirrim will be hitting Max, I think, Friday. Though this past Friday, I should say, by the time this episode comes out. So essentially start beginning of March. So if you want to see it,
I thought it already was on there.
I thought it was already there too.
It was available. It wasn't available on Max. It was available for digital purchase. One of those things where, if you want to actually, rent it, pay to rent it, or things like this. But now it's just going to be on, Max straight up. So,
okay.
So
do you know, I have completely forgotten about that movie. Genuinely,
Yeah.
I forget that it exists, which is not a great sign.
No. So,
No.
We'll see what the future holds. So, in any event, our episode on that, of course, a couple months back. So, if you forgot that, you can re-listen to that too. But we have our new episode right now and a new topic to talk about, and it is Jared's. And as mentioned, what a fun choice of topic. Jared, do please take it away.
Lobelia Sackville-Baggins, welcome to the Resistance. I want to say this is probably the most minor character we've ever actually talked about.
Yeah.
Certainly the one with the least actual effect on the story or the world. I'd say, not that the movies are a guide to significance, but she's so minor that in the theatrical version of Fellowship of the Ring, she isn't even named. She's just like that voice banging on the door. And she is, of course, a relative of Bilbo by marriage. Her husband is a Baggins, and Bilbo's heir until Frodo is adopted. Her role at the end of The Hobbit and beginning of Lord of the Rings is to act as an avatar of Hobbit bourgeois pettiness. She is implied to have stolen Bilbo's spoons, famously. She wants Bag End so powerfully that she's rude to anybody who's in her way, including the legal owners. And she definitely does try to steal a bunch of knickknacks after Bilbo's disappearance. And she's rude to the waiter, by which I mean Sam, which is basically unforgivable. The stench of social climbing. And I'm sure it sounded, based on the end of the last episode, it sounds like Ned will probably have a lot to say about the real world inspiration here, so I'm going to leave that aside for a second.
Yeah.
And then after all of that, Frodo leaves Hobbiton, and we kind of forget about her. She's mentioned, I think, as an annoyance a time or two, and that's it. And then we get to the end of Return of the King, a whole year later, thousands of pages, it feels like, in story time. And the Scouring of the Shire. We get to the Scouring of the Shire. We did a whole episode on that you can listen to with the very same ears you're using for this episode, which is a bargain. And she's still a minor character, but now she's an inspiration. When Saruman's men try to do something at Bag End, build sheds, I think, she reaches her breaking point, and she's one of the few hobbits to actually really resist before Frodo and company arrive. She's locked up for that, and the last we see of her, Frodo is rescuing her from jail. She's still clutching her umbrella, and when she dies soon after, she leaves all of that, all that remains of her money for Frodo to help hobbits displaced by the Trouble, which is nice. But for a character with about 4 appearances on the page, she looms large, at least in my mind. Apparently other people's too. And part of that is I love any sour old woman character. But I think the rest of it is she demonstrates a kind of, I want to say an ennobling of the Hobbit spirit that has nothing to do with the way that any other character is ennobled. It feels like the wrong word, but it's been a month, so I don't. Anyway, it's a hard month. I mean, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin basically have to leave home to learn and grow and become capable of effective resistance. And it's very easy to get the impression from the text that encounters with elves, wizards, and Númenóreans are the only way anyone else can become good or effective. And here Lobelia is, a hobbit to her core, a true hobbit, never leaving the Shire, and she stands up to the bad guys. Not, I wouldn't say effectively, but she tries. She betters herself. She doesn't have to leave home to find out who she is. And so it's very touching to see this character whose growth is not traced on the page, but who clearly has grown and whose power comes initially from the vanity, anger, and selfishness that made her unpleasant to begin with. There's still a lot of lacunae in her story, honestly, too many to start theorizing about what she may have been up to during the War of the Ring. How aware was she of Lotho's schemes? Or did she, white woman it up until things became intolerable, even for her? Or was she ignorant ignorant willfully or otherwise. We just don't know. But she does act eventually, and that's what matters. Lobelia is an imperfect ally, let's say. I love her. Anyway, thank you both for joining me in the Lobelia Sackville-Baggins Appreciation Hour. Let's all go around and say what Lobelia Sackville-Baggins has meant in our lives. I'm kidding, but also not, because honestly, when I announced this at the end of the last episode, you were both way more excited than I expected, which is right and good. But I really want to know why. Why are you so excited?
Okay, Oriana, please go first. Floor is yours.
It is one of those things where, like, there are so few female characters in The Lord of the Rings. And yeah, I was actually just talking about this with some people yesterday about, I do talk about other things than that are not Lord of the Rings, but sometimes you're just with like-minded people. And, it was kind of interesting. Like, there are so few female characters in The Lord of the Rings, and yet those that are there loom really, really large, even with such limited page presence. I don't know. But it is this this fact that Lobelia turns, she does a face turn. I'm not even like a big wrestling person, but she does this like incredible face turn using, Jared, as you pointed out, the very things that made her a heel in the first place. This incredible stubbornness. And it is notable that, like, she does kind of white woman it up in that, like, she does not act until the ruffians are coming to set up sheds at Bag End, which is her home. So, there is that. And yet she pays her penance. A good reminder when I'm feeling perhaps a little frustrated with certain people. Groups.
And as for me, well, my excitement of the character and still about this whole thing, it comes from several sources. Not so much necessarily the real world analogs that might be, because I actually wasn't thinking about that in that thing. You can pick up that more yourself, Jared, if you like, if we'll talk about that. But backing into other reasons first, something I think is interesting, and it only just occurred to me just now. I'm not saying this is absolutely the case, don't get me wrong, but I was casting my mind back just now, and I'm like, is she the only of the few, as Oriana's noted, characters who are women in Lord of the Rings who is actively shown to be and clearly recognized to be a mom? Which sounds flippant, but it's sort of like, we know Galadriel is ultimately Arwen's grandmother. That doesn't really come up, though.
No.
Éowyn, it's before her has things. Shelob and all that. Whereas Lobelia is fitted in as being not only married, but also has a kid. And I'm like, that's an interesting dynamic. This idea of, like, family honor, however described and all that, in a very concrete and immediate way. Lotho, who is truly a shadowy figure and all that, there's almost nothing to him beyond the fact that he exists. It's one of those things I still remember when I first read it.
And has acne.
Yeah. Lotho pimple. That's all anyone ever knows about him. It's one of those things like, okay, she functions in this family context, but again, the idea is that she is the great survivor after her husband dies, famously disappointed that, he wasn't able to get a chance himself. So I found that sort of like an interesting factor. But the thing that sort of like struck my mind, and we've touched on this already, but just to sort of really cast it wide open, is how she, I don't want to say more than any other character, but in a very concrete, specific sense, in ways that Jared has already outlined, introduces this whole idea of Tolkien basically being raised and coming in with a sense of, let's call it 19th century English social satire / portrayal of the small town people and all that in many different contexts. It is clearly meant to be partially satiric, in a very particular way. It is Tolkien sort of responding against, sense of surroundings and these type of pettinesses, as you say, and all that. But it's interesting to me that you can cast the net broadly, and you see how Lobelia and the family and all this functioning and the squabbling over the house, you can draw connections to everything almost everything from Eliot to Dickens to Jane Austen to Thomas Hardy in many different types of ways. Certainly, these are 4 very different authors, all working in, you could say, general sort of spheres at different points of time. It's interesting seeing Tolkien in this very, very slim particular way in this larger story that he's created, an amalgamation from so many different sources about how he introduces that into this context in a way, especially, when I was first starting to read it. Well, I'd heard some of these names already when I was in middle school. I don't think I had read Jane Austen by that point. I don't think I had read much of Dickens beyond maybe Christmas Carol by that point. Certainly not Eliot or Hardy. And so in a weird way, it was sort of this introduction in a very indirect way to this particular kind of English social literature in a way that, in this broader thing of it's a fantasy trilogy. It's like, but it's also this. I really find that fascinating. And Lobelia is very much a focus point for that, precisely because of the way she acts, precisely because of how it is. And interestingly, that makes the turn, as Oriana was saying, all the much more richer. All of a sudden, the stereotype character seemingly is revealed to have a certain depth, and the story ends up in a much different place.
Yeah, she, in a way, is kind of an avatar of she's Sam's dark mirror. In that they're both so Hobbity, but she has more of the bad traits and he has more of the good traits, which is, a huge part of where the social satire comes in. Yeah, this is probably my first introduction to that kind of thing as well. I was introduced to the satire before I was introduced to any sort of real thing. Yeah, no, that's interesting. The mother aspect. It's I hadn't really thought about it in those terms before, but yeah, you're totally right.
it just sort of occurred to me because it's interesting that she doesn't become the chief or anything like that. There's a sense that she could never become the chief. She's more than happy for her kid to become the chief, whatever sort of public facing role he has, even while there's darker manipulations. To draw comparisons to the current state of the world, if you like, but and how certain moms have been acting about their annoying fail son, shall we say? So, but there is something to that. The idea that she's almost like trying to secure back end as the ultimate base of operations, if you will.
So this is something that I wish we've talked a few times about how infuriating it is that he will put so much of the more interesting stuff off the page in letters or whatever. So there's all of this stuff in the letters that's not even in the appendices about how, Otho Sackville-Baggins wouldn't merely be Bilbo's heir at Bag End. He would inherit, the headship of the Baggins family if Bilbo hadn't come back. So there's all of this motivation for Lobelia that is off the page, and I kind of want it there. I know it's not the story of Lobelia and some adventurers. It's
right.
Lord of the Rings. But it's so interesting that there's all of this stuff that she is on the point of achieving when Bilbo shows back up, and she's like, okay, this ruined my life. It's not, and he's not nice to them. It's not, it's kind of a two-way street. They're not pleasant, but he's also not nice to them in return.
Well, and also, he's just one guy. Bilbo, before Frodo comes to live with him, is just one guy living in all of Bag End, which is that's like one person living in a pretty amazing 5-bedroom brownstone and just taking up all this space that I don't know if there were other children that Lobelia and Otho had, and they just aren't.
I think they just had the one.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting.
If I had Lotho, I would have stopped after that too. I wouldn't want to risk.
I'm done with this. I wonder if Lobelia feels like the kind of character who would have a son and go, okay, I don't have to do this anymore. I did it. I secured the line.
Achieved the heir.
Yeah, especially because, I don't know, the brace girdles aren't some super prominent, or it was definitely a step up for her to marry.
It was a step, which is part of why she's so desperate to get what she can, because the hobbits are in their own way pretty status obsessed. So, not in there's only so many degrees in their society; they can't get that far up. But they are kind of like, this
seems pretty mostly immobile. There aren't a lot of opportunities for social advancement.
Yeah, it feels partly like what matters to her is having somebody she can look down on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is interesting. Really quickly, the real world inspiration that I mentioned, and I don't actually know a ton about it, aside from it was sort of drawn from the life of Vita Sackville-West, who was Virginia Woolf's paramour, and who was desperately bitter over not inheriting her childhood home because even though she was the eldest child, she was a girl and could not inherit it.
And that
it
does
seems
suck, man. Like,
it does suck.
Come on.
It does suck. Yeah, well, it was specifically that, like, this is so silly, but for whatever reason, the Sackville family, like the real world Sackville family, just on their own, were like, we're going to follow Salic law, so women can't inherit. Whereas other families in the UK, I guess you can just do this if you're in the UK. They can be like, you know what, we're going to do absolute primogeniture. Eldest child gets everything, but then individual families can go like, no, you know what, we're going to be extra misogynistic today. Which is, how do you even, whatever. This is not the place to litigate the failures of the British aristocracy.
Or
is it? But yeah, that was basically it. It seems like it was kind of a well-known thing at the time that she was really mad about this.
Yeah, well-known enough, I figure. I mean, Tolkien, there's a certain stereotype that Tolkien, like locked into only the things that he was most interested in, didn't pay attention to that. I think more recent research has pointed out things like, even where he disagreed in terms of things like literature and other things and conclusions out there, he read fairly widely. He was, he was very much a person in his century, in his time, not somebody just simply locking himself up somewhere else and going like, it's all 1500s around here. No. Yeah. And all that. So he was no fool. I mean, in as much as, Oxford as institution is as much a social network discussion type thing as anything else and all that. So, I mean, the great story in the letters about, him, about Robert Graves introducing him to Ava Gardner and vice versa and all that. And the idea that he's, conversing with Graves is sort of like, oh, it's Graves, even though he doesn't really agree with him on anything. He's sort of like, oh yeah, sure, and all that. He knows who he's dealing with, and he will have heard the stories. So, this is kind of a scattershot episode in some ways because there's not a ton really. But originally, my plan was to kind of use this to talk about like old women in Tolkien. Okay, all right.
And I don't know what I want to say about that aside from the fact that there's not that many women, and most of them are either ageless, like Galadriel and Arwen, or like old, like Lobelia and Ioreth. And obviously we all love Ioreth. But why are the old women all kind of comic relief in some ways? What's happening here? Like, I don't know that there's much to say about this. That's just when I was trying to think of, ways to approach this. It's like, well, where are all the old women?
Is this maybe an unconscious reproduction? Because I don't think like this would have been really top of Tolkien's mind as he was writing. But this sort of unconscious reproduction of this attitude in culture of post-menopausal women being kind of superfluous and, it is a little easier there's less social stigma in making fun of them or, having them be the butt of the joke because they are no longer like performing. It's kind of interesting because Galadriel gets to be a sage. But Ioreth and Lobelia are primarily comedic presences, although they also, both of them do also get their little like moments of wisdom, let's say wisdom, and Lobelia moves Frodo with her gift, so that's nice. I don't know, I wonder if maybe that was kind of there.
And I think there's I'm sorry to interrupt. I think there's also a way you can not turn around these points you made, but there's something in that you could argue that maybe it's then their seeming superfluity. Just spelling that out there.
I know that's
getting the term right. Is that in turn that makes them all the more, dare I say, mouthy. And it's sort of just sort of talking that, and that actually is a good thing. I can think of other examples too. In Aldarion and Arendis, we have Mother Zaman, I think her name is, who is at the in Emery, where Arendis has her little shepherd farm, essentially, all that, or grand house, or however you want to put it. And, and she takes no crud. And the sense that all three of them, Ioreth, her, and Lobelia, is that, their tongue is out there. They may be coming at it like some more sharply than others, but they're not holding back, and they're not really cowed by anybody. In some respects, that's exactly the case. What happens to Lobelia? Some guy gives her guff. She's like, heck with you, and she gets hauled away for it. And
trying to attack them with her little umbrella.
Brilliant. And Ioreth is more sort of, maybe seen as sort of like, oh, well, there's this, it's sort of like, it's amazing when you think about it. It's like, wait, a big, huge battle just happened, and we're getting her just going like, hey, what are you going to do? Things like
well, and I'm sure everyone has at some point chatted with an older woman, either like a relative or something, and just been like, oh, wow, you have a lot to yep, still talking. Okay, all right.
And obviously, there's that sense of, the figure fun sort of thing, like, getting all that. So, and, it's Tolkien playing around with types, and, he uses as much, but he does use it in interesting ways. I think one of her earlier, cutting moments, which I think is just a great illustration of like dialogue. I whenever I read it, I'm always just delighted by it, is when she's, just basically, removed out of the house, and, it's like the idea Lobelia is thinking of some sort of crushing response, and she literally is so mad she can't say anything. You're just a brandy buck, out the door. Hey, did you hear that, Mary? Yeah. Mary just thinks like that. And I'm like, okay, that is the type of thing that makes me happy. It's good classic, people just, again, the pettiness, but also the humor, and just sort of like, whatever.
Yeah, I love when she like, it's like she took the point, but she also took the spoons.
Yeah.
Like, she gets what she wants.
Yeah. Yeah. Queen. I do. The comparisons with Ioreth are, I want to say, instructive, just to sound fancy, but like they're both character types. They also both get unexpected moments of importance. Like Ioreth is the one who's like the hands of the king or the hands of the healer, and Gandalf is like, yes, you are correct. Which of course then turns into like she's kind of bragging about it. Like, that's how everybody found out he was king, was because I said something, which whatever. But giving them that, not letting them just be like the stock, like chatty old lady or mean old lady. They also get to do things that are important, if minor. But that little turn, I think, I like that. I appreciate that one. When we've looked at imitators of Tolkien, that's something that they tend to miss, is like the character just stays in type and doesn't ever do anything outside of that. Like in Sword of Shannara or Silver Call, it's like everybody's just like doing the folksy, like, yeah, Mr. Frodo kind of thing, without any sort of dignity or importance, or grandeur is the wrong word to use for Ioreth and Lobelia, but nobility, I guess, like minor moments of nobility. Dignity, of course. The most obvious word.
It's there. You just had to nail it down.
I just had to talk around it for 5 minutes to find it.
I think there's something, and again, this touches maybe more on Ioreth rather than Lobelia, but the point that Tolkien raises about, I've used this quote numerous times over the years because it's so great. It's the one that was highlighted by Christopher Tolkien in the very first volume of the Book of Lost Tales, where Tolkien himself, in a letter to Christopher, was open about the fact that his myths, his core myths, essentially, that an audience might think they had too much high style, no hobbits, as he put it, and that the hobbits in Lord of the Rings provide a sort of nice vector in to this wider scope. In other words, the familiar beats of something like the social satire of the initial chapter or two of Fellowship of the Ring helps condition an audience to be aware of. It's like, oh, okay, we've read these kind of stories before. It's sort of like, oh, well, where does it go from there? And what's interesting is that Ioreth actually sort of functions that way herself, because I think one of her prime moments isn't even the big back and forth in the Houses of Healing. It's when she's talking to her even more rustic cousin who's in. Yep. And sort of like, this is the type of thing, you read about all these like grand ceremonies and things like this and ceremonial stuff. And Tolkien is revealed a voice of what's going on. What is one couple people in the crowd doing while all this is going on? They're just talking crap. Just things like that. Just sort of like, oh, this is this and this is that, and I'm like, that's lovely. That's a great touch. That right there is something you don't see too much of that. Instead, you see people being all grand, sort of like, yeah, what are the actual people in the back of the room actually saying and things like this? I love it. And it suits the character. It fits the character, too. It's not something out of nowhere.
Yeah. That kind of, I want to say almost like positive pettiness, where it's a character going on about some really minor, like, I guess she's talking about the coronation, it's not that minor, but like Ioreth specifically being like really discursive on points that are irrelevant to the topic at hand feels very Tolkien. Heading back to Lobelia, that there's a lot of like petty evil in the Scouring of the Shire stuff, where it's like, oh, you cut down the party tree for no reason, all this stuff. But Lobelia, I think, represents a pettiness of good. Like she's paying, she learns enough to pay attention to what, there's poor hobbits around, and I've got to take care of them. So here's this money, Frodo. Do whatever you want with it, which is really, really lovely. This small heroism. It's not like showy. It's not blowing a horn to summon allies or anything. It's just like, I've got it. I can find this way to help.
It's also interesting. This is another thing that just occurred to me just now, is that we have across Lord of the Rings, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the case, that if we're talking about let's call them our good characters or just simply our hobbits, but primarily, but I think really just everybody who's like anti-Sauron, let's say, that we have 3 instances of people who are not merely being, in conflict, but are captured and or imprisoned throughout the entire story. The first would be Merry and Pippin when they're captured by the Uruk-hai. They're not, held in any one place, but obviously their movements and everything are limited. More specifically, of course, Frodo is captured and put into Cirith Ungol, and, and everything is there is like, he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. The classic, prisoner's dilemma is sort of like, in a very real sense. Geez, I'm surrounded by orcs and things like that. It's, what's going on? And we get, in a brief sense from him about what that was like, especially his fear that, the ring had already been found. Then there's Lobelia. Lobelia is the one, we hear about other hobbits being taken away to the holes and things like this, but Lobelia is the one that we specifically heard about that was actually hauled away. And the note about her being like led out again and getting the sense of freedom. Someone who had actually gone through something deeply distressing that in a weird way, she could compare notes with Frodo about. Not that there's any sense of like that doing that on a much smaller level, on a much pettier level, but still, hauled away and put away and things like that. So, and just not knowing what's going to happen and just realizing that. And, the sense is that, that little outburst that we see recorded when she goes up against the ruffian is kind of, that's the last we see of her in that mode. It's kind of like the last moment. And from that point on, I don't think she's actually even directly quoted much. It's more just sort of like expected in by the narrator. But you get a sense that she was, she really has been transformed by the experience. And, there's a lot to unpack with that because, so many comparison points one can make, to unfair imprisonment, to, and things like this, the pettiness of being locked away, no way around it. Think of 8 million comparison points. We can think of them all, I'm sure. We can think of even ones we don't even want to think about, but which are true and real in our real world, however defined. And that's kind of what we have here. Somebody who, again, was unlike, Merry and Pippin, part of the party, or Frodo, the center quest, which is somebody caught up in this all. A last little tail end of all this thing, and it had that kind of horrible effect. And even if it sort of showed her away beyond what she was and all that, you get a sense of somebody who was literally broken by the experience. I think it's worth noting.
Yeah, and all the conflicting emotions and sort of thought processes that someone like Lobelia has to contain within themselves. So, like, she is the Pimple's mother, and probably a lot of the reason he is the way he is probably encouraged at least some of his actions in her like desire for increased social status. But then and then she has this sort of NIMBYism that results in her going up against, I am picturing a full on like man, so this like tiny 100-year-old hobbit lady just waving a pink umbrella. I don't know, it's pink in my imagination. I don't actually know if
I've always pictured it as yellow.
That's
it
more
never
striking.
Says.
Yeah,
it never says, but
pink doesn't make any sense. But that's fine. She has this stubbornness and this strength to her, and she gets locked up for it. Even her son can't help her, and so he's either powerless or complicit, and that's devastating. And then she has to deal with finally being released, and he's dead, and she's devastated, and also people are cheering, and like the only reason this could even resolve is like her son probably would have had to die at some point. So that's a lot for 100-something-year-old Hobbit lady to like be carrying around.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the fact that how Lotho died is one of the most gruesome fates in the entire book, frankly, as far as we know.
Do we think that Wormtongue ate him?
I don't know. So here's the thing about that. Like,
it's Saruman, right?
Saruman likes to say what will hurt people. Mm-hmm. So it makes a lot of sense that he would just say that. So, but maybe because Wormtongue is kind of shifty about it, he doesn't say, no, I didn't.
He just says, you made me do it. It's like, made you do what? So.
And then, he kills the only person who could actually.
Right.
So, I don't know.
It's something there, yeah. I have an idea of something else that they just sort of like, again, talking about Lobelia and bring it up. And again, getting back, I think, to the social satire aspect of it is one of the most delightful, well, two things I think to bring up. One is sort of getting back to the idea of status and head of the families is, I think, the gentle but important touch. And, Sackville as a name, the connection, as Jared was noting, to Sackville West and all that. The idea that in some cases you have families like, oh, these are the Baggins, but these are the Distaff ones. They're the hybrid ones. The name itself not being just a Baggins name. It's sort of like, that's the type of thing that you get senses of how that can work. Especially it's sort of like, oh, you're not as pure as us. Not that we see that in this story, but you almost wonder about the suggestion of it. And there's more going on there that, one can unpack, but I always found that interesting. The other thing I also especially like, and this is easily one of my favorite bits of the book, is when everyone shows up the day after the birthday party expecting their gifts. And they're sort of like, he's gone, but we start getting gifts, right? And we get the whole listing of all these other details of all these hobbits that we essentially only hear about once, and the gifts they get. And you get the sense of this society and what it functions and how it goes, and the little pointed messages and things like that. So, and how some of the gifts are a little more, like have zings attached to them than others. My favorite one is how Rory Brandybuck gets all the wine and sort of like, I forgive you for everything I said about you. Well, thank you so much. And I'm like, I love stuff like that. That's just great.
The social satire aspect is so funny because, like, imagine, I don't know, Elizabeth Bennet gets back from Derbyshire and her mom has been, like, freaking locked up for something. Like, what? Yeah. Like, what is this total shit?
Yeah.
Not that it doesn't work. It's just so funny.
That is important, really. Just a reminder to everybody, we did have an episode on the Scouring the Shire. Do give it a listen. We'll have a link in the show notes. But I think that is that idea that how much has changed. What we know has changed in a definite sense, and that sense of corrosion and how that can just sort of go from there. In some respects, the humor in Lobelia going up against the ruffian, and sort of like when any other context, if it had been someone else doing that, it was sort of like, that Lobelia doing it again. The simple act becomes heroism. The satiric, the thing, I think, how Lobelia would act suddenly becomes something that's like much greater than that, precisely because it shows that even as things have changed around her, she hasn't changed. This turns out to be something that is causes her grief. And again, one of the more important things about her being locked away is that, her son dies and she only learns about it after the fact. There's no chance to say goodbye. I mean, that's crushing. That's crushing. And the fact that Tolkien allows for that, even in the brief mention about the fact that, when she received news of it, that broke her. He doesn't dwell on it, but that's a big thing. It's one of those things that, it's like, I think it's a generous touch on Tolkien's part. It's a generous touch that this character who initially would have just been something of a foil and something sort of, signing all that, however, especially in the earlier drafts of it, by the end is something, it's close to tragic, if not indeed fully so. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, isn't it point? I think Farmer Cotton says something about, like, she's the only person who actually loved Lotho.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is like,
But somebody did.
Somebody did.
Somebody did. That's important. So
yeah. I felt like I wanted to talk more about her as a symbol of resistance, because that is kind of what she does become in the story.
Right.
I also don't know what I have to say about that, is the thing. So if either of you have things to talk about in that regard, the only thing that I really think I have to say, I kind of already touched on in the introduction, is the way that her negative qualities, like as you said, she's still Lobelia, are what enable her to be a symbol. Like, yeah, she kind of sucks to be around, but she's getting stuff done, kind of. Like, she doesn't change anything, really. She kind of is an inspiration in some ways, and enough that she's Farmer Cotton specifically is like, yeah, she showed more spirit than most. I don't know. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? Really?
My take on it would be that in not so many words, and I'm not even saying that Tolkien himself was going to be like, trying to hammer this home as a "do you see" moment. Maybe he was.
Oh, I absolutely doubt it.
yeah. But I think the idea is that if anything, you can't look for paragons when you're trying to carry out these actions. You can't look for perfect people. That doesn't exist. People are doing what they can in the scopes of what they have, and you have to realize the cane art is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Okay, whatever. But in this sense, in this rather different sense, it's more the sense of like, who's with you on this, and in what circumstances. And even if they arrive late, and even if they arrived unconditionally, isn't it better that they sort of saw later than never at all? That would be kind of like my, as much as there's a read on it, I would say that, it's, I think it's something that it's an essential reminder that sometimes that's what it takes.
Yeah.
Though I don't think Tolkien was thinking that at all. I think he was, no. I totally think that he was just like, what would be like kind of the funniest, like, or, the most surprising, I guess, person.
Okay, yeah.
The most surprising sort of big resistor. I'm sure, like, at this point, we had lots of stories of unlikely paragons of the resistance in occupied Europe. And so I'm sure he drew on some of that. It's a shame that that would never have made it into this book. The Dutch teens who would seduce and lure Nazi soldiers to their deaths in the woods.
We don't know that wasn't happening, but it probably wasn't.
Oh no!
Like in the Shire.
Oh yeah, in the Shire. Rosie Cotton.
Okay,
she's got a lot to tell.
Pause the episode while I log into our.
Oh my god, is this on AO3? Am I going to have to write this?
I was about to say, I think the fanfic writers have probably done something here.
Yeah, I might as well. I appreciate that. I feel like one thing I see a lot in internet discourse, which is the only kind of discourse I see because I'm too online, is like, oh, you're only showing up now that you're threatened. And it's like, yeah, sometimes, or maybe even most of the time, that's when people show up. It's very hard to get people to care about something that doesn't affect them specifically. You can do it. It's not impossible, but it can be very difficult. And I feel like we've got to be more like Farmer Cotton.
Yeah.
And be like, yeah, I mean, she showed up late and she only showed up when her home was threatened, but she showed up and she showed spirit. And just be a little bit more generous with the people that finally realize that something bad is happening and try to do something about it.
The trying to do something about it is like the most important thing. And Lobelia does. She not only before, but after. So like,
it's not her fault that nobody else attacks people with umbrellas. There wasn't a movement that followed her, but there could have been in a slightly different story.
I'm starting the pink umbrella movement.
There you go.
During the 2020 protests in Seattle, because it's Seattle, everybody had umbrellas, and they became a symbol of resistance. At least here, I think the imagery became nationally known. I think it spread a little bit, but it was so funny. Me specifically here in this city, and being like, "Oh my God, everybody's Lobelia!"
Wow.
So what you're saying is this episode is like 5 years later. This has been 5 years in the making, more or less.
Yeah. Kind of, yeah.
Building up to it bit by bit. So maybe we want to start sort of heading towards a conclusion, wrapping things up, keeping an eye on the time. So my own final thought on Lobelia is that These days, we're so used to, and I'm thinking about things like, the recent sale as of a few days ago about how Amazon, speaking of, has taken over the full James Bond experience, and how everyone's immediate thought was going to be like, okay, great, 8 million prequel series and other horrible things like this. And these days is the type of thing that you could see in other hands. People sort of like, oh, let's create this whole backstory about the Baggins interplay, and we'll do a little thing, and it'll be this and all that. It's sort of like, you don't need that. you don't
maybe
need that.
You don't.
Well, all right,
no, I'm
maybe
kidding.
I'm wrong.
I'm kidding. But maybe.
Totally wrong. Maybe. But sometimes a character is just enough. So true. We don't know more about Lobelia. We don't know where what her exact family circumstances were. We know nothing of the Lobelia Otho love story, which maybe was a great love story. You never know. They might have.
We're only seeing them after the passion has died.
Yeah. Who knows what happened to them? Maybe they started off fresh as maybe they're equivalent of the young hobbits dancing on the table in Bilbo's birthday dinner and all that at one point. Who knows what happened 60 years prior? You don't know and all. But sometimes and of course, because we only know so much, that makes her more of a type, you could say. But in his own way, I think Tolkien and the minor characters, for lack of a better term, scattered throughout.
That's my new band name.
Hey, there
Tolkien
you go.
and the minor characters.
Yeah. Scattered throughout The Lord of the Rings. We mentioned Ioreth, but you could also throw in people casting even more broadly. People like Baragond, people like, some of the Glorfindel even, and things like this. These people who appear and are part, or maybe even, I can't remember the name of the elf who leads the wandering company that they encounter in the Shire on their way to Farmer Maggots. People like that who only appear briefly and who are part of the wider story. They're there, but they're not the focus, but they make the world richer. And I think that's I think that's really this thing that it's great to think about, and it's great to fun to speculate. We've done things like this, but I just love the fact that they're there. It's not just simply our hero going around and doing things and that's it. And it's a much more fragmented, much more interwoven story as a result.
They're there and they add texture, but they are also in themselves detailed enough that they don't feel like types.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which, I not to rag on Tolkien imitators for the 90th time this episode, but that's one thing that it's not unique to him, but it's one thing that his imitators miss, is giving these minor characters who are in one scene or a couple of scenes, is giving them enough specificity that when Lobelia has her face turn, you're like, yeah, that's Lobelia. You know who she is, even if you don't know anything about her, like her hot love story or whatever. There's enough given to her that is specific to Lobelia that she can do that, and it feels right, and it's great. And not everybody does that with their minor characters, unfortunately. Yeah.
Any last thoughts, Oriana? Or
oh, right. Yeah. Slay Queen.
Yeah, right. I'm proud of myself for going this entire episode without saying that about her.
Someone had
Queen
to.
I said Queen at one point, but at no point did I say Slay Queen. So.
And on that note. All right, time has come to talk about choosing the next episode topic. That choice has come around to me. So, next episode will be our 6th anniversary. 6 years we've been going so far.
Wow.
It's crazy to think about, but it's true. Now, my co-hosts love me, you see, because I usually use the anniversary episode to pick things like, as we just talked about, maybe a sort of Shannara, or maybe a Silvercall duology, or maybe a questionable adaptation or two that we've looked at. And I've been subject to various, threats and calumnies whenever this has come up, and somehow we've gone through it all. And of course, you'd think that I'd want to continue that. But I am kind. And in fact, this is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I was thinking about suggesting doing last year, but then I thought sort of Shannara, because I thought it would be funnier to do the 5th anniversary, and again, somehow I'm survived.
I'm still nervous. This build-up is still making me nervous.
Don't be nervous. This is something I've mentioned more than once before. It's finally time to talk about it. Let's us finally do the 1981 BBC Radio Lord of the Rings adaptation. Long overdue to do this. Possibly my favorite adaptation in general, even beyond the films, in terms of as close to the book as possible. But that's something we'll talk about in the episode. So, just a quick heads up for folks about this. First, we must be very clear about this. This is the 1981 BBC radio version, not the 1979 American radio version, which is the mind's eye version you've often seen packaged. The quality difference between the two cannot even begin to be described, so make sure you're finding that one. The other thing we'll note is that while you can find a version of it streaming on Audible, it is edited. There are, however, more complete versions out there because one, you can purchase it like on CD or things like this. You can probably find that for cheap. All 13 hours. It is a 20. It was originally done as 26 half-hour episodes. It came spread across 13 discs that way. There are, however, also complete versions floating around on various websites, shall we say. You may see us link them around and things like this that will give you exactly what you want to need. And so just make sure you're hearing that one. So that's all I'm going to say, because it is 13 hours long if you want to catch up beforehand. So there's your homework if you like to think about it, but that is what we will be talking about next time at long last. So
all right,
something to look forward to there. So, and yes, you can't shout at me for this one. No terrible knockoffs or sequels and all that. I'll be interested in your reactions to it, but we'll get to that as we do. And I am actually looking forward to seeing what people think about this, especially if you had a chance, dear listeners, to hear it before. But otherwise, thank you all very much for listening in. We greatly appreciate it as always. Stay safe out there and stay focused with everything and going through. We look forward to seeing you next time. As always, please contact us at bythebywater@gmail.com. Follow us online at Blue Sky. You can find all three of us there individually as well as By the Water Show. And of course, the main website is megaphonic.fm/bythebywater. Do get a hold of us through any means if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, keep spreading the word. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk with you next time. Until then.